Right. Hello and welcome everyone coming in. Thank you for joining us today. I am Stephanie Rao, Executive Director for the National Council on Public History. NCPH is a membership association that helps public historians put history to work in the world through community building, programs, and scholarship. Thank you for joining us today for A Cultural Arsenal for Democracy, the World War II work of U.S. museums. Today's presentation is one of a four-part series that continues next week, exploring scholarship related to the World War II home front, facilitated as part of the National Park Service's World War II Heritage City program work. Before we get underway, just wanted to share a few housekeeping notes. This event has Zoom auto captions available, and to access them, hit the Show Captions button at the bottom of your Zoom toolbar. Feel free to use the chat area throughout the webinar to share where you're joining us from today, how nervous you are about the upcoming weather, and any thoughts you might have that you just want to share with one another about the history that we talk about today. And then you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen to submit questions for our speaker. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Emily Cambeck, Bureau Historian and National Coordinator for the American World War II Heritage City Program with the National Park Service. Emily will give us some words of welcome and introduce today's speaker. Emily?
Thank you, Stephanie, and hello, everyone. Welcome on behalf of the National Park Service, and thank you for joining us today. I'd like to thank Stephanie, Megan, and the team at NCPH for their partnership in expanding scholarship in public history on the World War II home front across multiple projects since Congress established the American World War II Heritage City Program back in 2019. This year's World War II Homefront webinar series is one of them. And I'd also like to thank and welcome today's speaker. Dr. Clarissa J. Ceglio is Associate Director of Collaborative Research for the University of Connecticut's Humanities Institute and Associate Professor of Digital Culture. Working at the intersections of museum studies, public history, and digital humanities, her research focuses on the ways in which cultural institutions, past and present, engage diverse communities in issues relevant to individual and civic thriving, particularly through the effective and rhetorical use of artifacts, material, visual, and digital, to construct national and social imaginaries. Her recent publications include A Cultural Arsenal for Democracy, the World War II work of U.S. museums, and Contributions to Radical Roots, Civic Engagement, Public History, and a Tradition of Social Justice Activism, and U.S. Museum Histories and the Politics of Interpretation, Never Neutral. Through her teaching and research, Ceglio collaborates with museums, libraries, and communities on interdisciplinary, public-facing, and grant-funded projects that engage diverse audiences in topics of contemporary concern. And indeed, given that this is an audience of public historians, all or in part in some way, I know that you can all appreciate the contemporary concerns and continuing relevance of work that helps us understand forces shaping cultural institutions and their influences on civic life. So thank you, and please welcome Dr. Ceglio.
Thank you all, and particularly to NCPH and NPS for putting on for a second year this incredible series, which I have been enjoying as a member of the audience. And today I want to start with the story of how I came to the topic of what U.S. museums did on the home front during World War II as a way to share where others, I hope here in this audience, can look in their own communities for the many aspects of this history that remain untold. After a life as an advertising copywriter, museum public relations person, journalist, and medical device technology writer, I went back to school. And I knew I wanted to study museums. And I was in the Wadsworth Atheneum looking for my master thesis topic, thinking I would chronicle when the first solo exhibits of women took place at that rather old institution. And in the course of going through member bulletin after member bulletin, starting with the first years, I, in the 20s, 30s, 40s, began noticing mentions of war and the various activities that the Athenaeum was undertaking. And I had never thought about the issue of what museums did during war before. Not too long after that, 9/11 came, and the issues of how museums decided to engage or not with issues of a contemporary war came to the front. And so the places where, particularly at the local level, one can begin to find this material are in the still not digitized, particularly for smaller institutions, press releases, members' bulletins, exhibit notes, and local newspapers talking about the varied activities that institutions around the U.S. did during World War II. Of course, I also drew from the American Association of Museums, then weekly newsletter, other books and publications about the field during this period. But I encourage you, although much more has been digitized since that work in the late 80s and early 90s, much is still buried in the files if it was kept at all. So indeed, it is the matter of story, and this is the term that museum practitioners embraced in the 1930s and 40s to describe what was then a new and rather controversial approach to exhibition craft that is at the heart of my book, A Cultural Arsenal for Democracy, published by the University of Massachusetts Press, and I hope you're all familiar with its wonderful public history series, which I am so proud to be a part of. Story also features in the work that I have contributed to the previously mentioned volumes shown here. And across this work, I deal with the history of efforts by some museums starting in the late 30s into the 40s to become agents of change and to encourage that change with storytelling exhibits. My work shows that mindful practitioners, then as now, sought to strike what they deemed in their time and place to be the right balance between their sense of public duty, prevailing professional norms, and aspirations to ground the civic decision-making of others in an informed understanding of the past and present. Putting social instrumentality into practice, however, involved complex navigations of political waters, public and institutional interests, unexamined racial biases, and working within an exhibitionary network of museums, government agencies, corporations, media firms, and advocacy groups, a network that exchanged, repurposed, and sometimes competed for collections and display materials, a network of connections that facilitated the circulation of materials and influence during World War II. Such institutional webs matter. They help illuminate the intertwined relationships among state power, capitalism, and cultural institutions that exist even when monetary support for museum work is absent, as was the case for much of this period, unless you were the Museum of Modern Art and Nelson Rockefeller was your government friend. My research focused here on a specific type of exhibition created for U.S. audiences. So I'm not looking at the many exhibits sent abroad. I'm looking at those created for and seen on the home front. The ones that are interesting to me are rooted in pre-war progressive impulses that experimented with immersive forms of storytelling as a means to engage museum goers' minds, bodies, and emotions. in order to inspire their intellects, abilities, and passions towards civic engagement. It's this nascent material rhetoric of social instrumentality that my book's case studies highlight. I chart too how such exhibits materialized overlapping national and supranational wartime imaginaries, such as the good neighborhood of hemispheric unity. Here, case studies reveal the difficulties practitioners encountered in advancing a hemispheric vision consistent with the ideal of co-equal national belonging. On the home front, the examples I'll share with you today underscore that while progressives hoped wartime patriotism would fuel public support for social reform, their efforts struggled to find footing in the prevailing imaginary of home front as solidarity, where civic stability rather than transformation, American unity rather than inequality, dominated the exhibitionary network. As early as 1942, the internationalists' one world vision of the peace to come, which emphasized inherent human sameness and respect for cultural diversity, seemed an apt match for museums' civic potential. Not long after the war ended, however, American museums largely abandoned the social instrument paradigm and its accompanying material rhetoric. That's the overview. But now let's take a step back. To understand museums' wartime work, we need to start in the 1930s. By this decade, a reawakened but small progressive movement arose within the U.S. museum field. Shaken by the social, political, and financial disruptions of the Great Depression, inspired by the adult education movement and New Deal populism, museum workers, including the first to have graduated from museum education training programs, questioned their institution's civic worth and sought new ways to attract and serve the public. Now, some of this was self-interested. If the public is not served, support is not forthcoming. But several studies emphasized that museums' obligations to serve democracy by fostering an educated public capable of clear-headed decision-making for the common benefit was not only advantageous to museums, but a duty that they needed to fulfill. Other influences at this time, including New Deal programs and particularly the Works Progress Administration, established museum-government relationships that later smoothed the way to wartime cooperation. And also worries about the power of mass communications and political propaganda and the ways in which both of these might erode the capacity for informed individual reasoning, an essential feature of any participatory democracy, ran high. To be clear, normative whiteness, racism, class prejudice, and other biases limited the bounds of this progressive vision, which again was a small strand within the larger field. Social instrumentality as practiced by white institutions, which predominated the U.S. museum scene, typically only defined the public in broad, vague strokes. Books, articles, and conference papers by museum and allied workers of the time offered and debated ideas about the best path forward. It was in this mix that the idea of the museum as social instrument was reinvigorated. Champions of this reform believed that museums carried a public obligation to bring their collections and other resources to bear on civic problems. The goal was not only to educate citizens about pressing issues, but to inspire them to act, to become involved in making change. Such goals led some practitioners to experiment with the then novel and still quite controversial idea that exhibits could be explicitly structured as multimedia stories designed to educate the mind, inspire the heart, and motivate the body to inform democratic participation. Every museum and every exhibit must tell a story, as one author put it. Museums borrowed techniques from some of the usual sources: world's fairs, department stores, and popular media. They integrated new technologies for affordable photographic enlargement, as well as for use of in-gallery sound and film. Exhibition design also took inspiration from European artists and museums. Just as museums large and small and of varied disciplines began to experiment with storytelling exhibits to instruct their local constituencies, war came to Europe and then to America, and this put social instrumentality to the test. The advent of new, highly publicized national agendas, first hemispheric unity as a means to avoid war, and then the war itself, focused progressive interests on the very things a growing number of museum professionals had been seeking: relevant issues of importance to their local and national publics. Before we look at how museums responded programmatically to the war, we need to understand the operational realities they faced. At the outset, some institutions sent the best of their collections into safe storage. Museum workers left to join the armed forces, Red Cross, industry, and other war-critical fields. This left many institutions understaffed and a few temporarily closed. The dwindling of WPA funds, and then in 1943, its complete cessation, made Depression-era budgetary losses even worse. In some places, museum attendance at the beginning of the war plummeted. Chicago area museums reported 20 to 30% decreases in early 1942. The Brooklyn Museum saw attendance drop by 27%, the Metropolitan Museum of Art by 13%. Causes included reduced leisure time owing to war-related work and volunteerism, and reduced visitation from outlying areas and school groups due to rubber and gasoline rationing. With men leaving their posts in greater numbers, women stepped into more prominent roles, often with a host of new operational burdens and without pay raise commensurate to their expanded duties. Despite these challenges, museums responded in varied and creative ways. The Nevada Museum was among more than several that installed an emergency hospital room in its facilities. The Springfield Museum of Fine Arts in Massachusetts gave over a wing for the United Service Organization Center. The Metropolitan Museum curators helped design protective gear for bombers' crews. Smithsonian researchers created survival on land and sea guides for troops. Later in the war, communities called on museums, particularly those with arts programs, to provide resources for injured veterans' rehabilitation. The need was significant enough that the Museum Council of New York and the New England Intermuseum Committee each published regional guides on best practices. While art-making programs predominated, museums experimented with different approaches. The Natural History Museum in San Diego reacclimated sailors by training them to catalog collections and gather specimens for their herbarium. The Detroit Institute of Arts worked with a psychiatrist to create a tour for war nerves, a brochure guiding visitors through 15 paintings selected for their qualities of order, harmony, and serenity. Throughout the war, exhibits served as the primary vehicle for engaging public with contemporary topics, from displays on modern warfare and allied cultures to soldiers' art, living maps of overseas actions, and other large format photography show. A minority among these efforts were exhibits seeking to carry that social instrumentality into the new national realities. One such example is the Museum of Modern Art's Wartime Housing, an exhibit in 10 scenes. U.S. wartime production had created a severe housing shortage as in-migrants flocked to newly created jobs in manufacturing boomtowns. Men, women, and children lived in tents, slept in cars. But residents of these communities remained reluctant to build. Reasons included class, race, and regional prejudices, but also the historical memory of what had happened to worker housing built during the Great War. When peace came, factories closed, workers departed, leaving ill-built structures to sit empty and decay or to become impoverished housing for the marginalized. An advocacy group of modernist architects, social reformers, and high-powered citizen organizers saw this moment as an opportunity to gain traction for cooperative community housing, planned developments that included health, childcare, and education facilities, parks, shared spaces, and walkable living. Some in the group had worked with MoMA before, so they approached the museum about an exhibit that would address public misgivings and equip lay people to engage in long-range planning so that what was built today would serve a progressive tomorrow. The final exhibit is a complex and fascinating example of social instrumentality that was designed to appeal to that mental, emotional, and physical capacity. It was conceived as an experience unfolding in dramatic scenes. It used light, film, sound, ceiling heights, and even varied floor textures to immerse museum goers in the problem as well as the proposed solution. One of the most visceral scenes shown here dramatized the plight of those ill-housed men, women, and children. The room itself was small, cramped. A single bare bulb cast a dim bluish light from a dropped ceiling painted black that hovered just 7 feet from the floor. Roughened carpets, distinct in texture and feel underfoot from the smooth, polished floors elsewhere in the museum, changed how visitors walked and, in accord with the exhibit script, muffled the sound of their movements. Ambient sound in the style of a radio drama began with the relentless dripping of a faucet that grew louder and louder, timed with a weary male voice saying, "The kitchen's in the bedroom, the parlor's in the bedroom, the laundry's in the bedroom." Then abruptly, the scraping of furniture, the clang of a dropped pot. Then, silence. Visitors were left to imagine that the man, having reached his boiling point, had pushed roughly away from the table where he sat, while his wife, caught off guard by the outburst, dropped her cooking utensils in shock or fear. Other cues hinted at the disruptions to family structure that such environments would provoke. So the scene not only sought to create a visceral connection between the museum visitor and the suffering workers, but also carried an undercurrent of menace, a warning about social breakdown. Later, visitors emerged into spacious, well-lit galleries. The ceiling heights returned to normal. Bright light replaced the oppressive gloom. The sound changed too. Cheerful noises of hammer and saw, men and women animatedly discussing community planning. Here were photographs of good housing design, well-planned communities, those parks, those playgrounds, those schools. Said one visitor of the experience, wartime housing is an altogether unique experience and the most effective presentation of a social problem in a museum setting. Another interesting case is the great idea, the idea of perfect and free individuals. It was a collaboration of the Social Museum of Vassar College in New York State and the National Conference of Christians and Jews, which counted Vassar's president as an active member. The plan put before the museum's faculty committee called for the creation of a reproducible tabletop exhibit that, through use of statistics and charts, would highlight the alarming rise of anti-Semitism, racism, and xenophobia in the U.S. The Vassar Social Museum was an interdisciplinary teaching learning lab that gave students experiences that we would today call community engaged research, to produce the museum's exhibits as part of their coursework in history, sociology, English, economics, and other subjects as suited the topic at hand. What seemed like a compatible match with the council even covering costs faltered when their point person sought control over exhibit content and suggested that an ad agency handle the design. The faculty committee drew a line, informing the college's president, quote, "The museum is something more than a collector of statistics, and we will not deliver the college outright to a propaganda agency." Here it is important to remember that in the 1930s and early 40s, the term propaganda retained its broader, less fraught meaning of dissemination or propagation, advertising. So in museum literature of the period, it frequently means nothing more than garden variety press releases or promotional efforts, unless the context makes clear that its second, more pernicious meaning is being invoked. In this case, the social museum used it to emphasize its ethical obligations as an educational institution, in distinction to the council as an advocacy group dedicated to promoting a particular viewpoint, and in contrast to ad agencies as communicators for hire. The collaboration proceeded on the museum's terms, becoming one of its best attended and most widely covered exhibits. The council benefited from national print and radio coverage, but the students' work, which filled several rooms, lacked both the professional polish and the compactness needed for the imagined tabletop exhibit that the council had planned to send out to its field offices and libraries across the U.S. Still, the great idea is remarkable on several counts. To build its case for greater tolerance, the exhibit opened with a summary of the nation's dark legislative history. It called out specific bills and acts that thefted native lands, restricted immigration by race or creed, segregated people by skin color, and limited voting rights. These and other facts, inconsistent with the great idea of democracy as enshrined in the Bill of Rights, placed current injustices in a longer lineage so as to refute claims that they were nothing more than isolated wartime measures. Indeed, Vassar's Social Museum was perhaps the only U.S. museum of the time to directly address the immigration policies that denied Jews sanctuary. Likewise, it decried the rise in discrimination against American and foreign-born Japanese, Germans, and Italians. The Great Idea stimulated conversation among the school groups, scout troops, and local civic, business, religious, and women's organizations that attended. Not all agreed with what they saw. As one exhibit organizer reported, quote, "Several persons have objected to the inclusion of the Japanese, but I feel we cannot ignore their contributions and problems just because we are fighting them." She continued, "Still others fear that Negro education will cause a thinning of the ranks of cheap labor." Of course, neither wartime housing nor the Great Idea were free of prejudice. Their critiques and calls to action remained largely blind to their own systems of power, privilege, and in both cases, whiteness that we routinely call out today. This is not to say that past practitioners were not reflective in their own ways. Correspondence, meeting notes, and other sources reveal their awareness of the forces shaping their work, and as well as their attempts to find balance among disagreements about narrative, emphases, and storyline. Still, wartime housing, the Great Idea, and other works informed by social instrumentality have typically been dismissed as patriotic propaganda. And of course, there was ample patriotic propaganda, even among museums. And neither did these works arise solely out of the all-out national mobilization due to the war. As I hope these examples demonstrate, there is more to the story. Social instrumentalists argued that museums needed to become more adept educational storytellers in order to bring a clear, rational voice to the marketplace of ideas. The dilemma, as they understood it, was how to use the strategies that made mass media messaging and even political propaganda emotionally compelling, but without also becoming agents of indoctrination. Those who championed social instrumentality believed that this was a line they could walk. And for me, this World War II history is a provocative backdrop against which to consider the returned cultural emphasis in the early 2000s to the power of story. As a public history teller myself and digital humanist, I think of the integration of emotional and physical cues now made possible through newer immersive technologies, virtual reality among them, that can produce embodied affects, neurological responses, and dispositional alignments. There are many ethical lines to consider here, and we must undertake more well-designed studies to learn how to walk them, in addition to bringing our reflective public history practices into their making. Lastly, as varied fields note, social epistemology and social ontology happen through narratives. That is, we come to know, understand, and make sense of the social world through narratives. And as others have argued, it is through narrativity that we constitute our social identities. And this is why story power comes with great responsibility and demands continued critical thought as we invoke it as a framework for our shared endeavors. And again, I would like to thank you, particularly those who have tuned in and given me your attention for a long spell, and I look forward to answering questions.
Thank you so much for that excellent presentation. It was really a delight to learn more about your research in this area. Just a reminder to everyone on the webinar today, if you have questions that you would like us to discuss at this point, you can enter them in the Q&A feature on your screen. And I'll start out with a question of my own for you. If you were to suddenly come up with an abundance of time to continue your research in this area, what's something that you wish that you could delve further into, or that you would encourage, historians in our community to think about in their own research?
Let's see. Boy, some things that immediately come to mind that follow from my research or that I didn't have enough time to adequately pursue. And certainly there are works out there that are chapter length or journal article length, and is just a bit of a scene setter. To my knowledge, my book is still the only book-length work on museums' World War II activities. There are great chapters within edited volumes, institutional histories, journal articles, but I would love to have delved deeper into women's roles in terms of that set of graduates coming out of Newark and the Sachs program at Harvard University that have been the earliest classes to be trained as museum educators. How I would love to trace individual journeys. So a book that took several individuals who graduated, got into museum work either in the 30s or in the 40s, and what their wartime journeys looked like, and how those accomplishments continued or not when the war ended. There's great work on Laura Bragg, and I'm forgetting the name of the director of the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, who was active in hemispheric unity and then later in the UN, and Grace Morley McCann or McCann Morley. I always get those confused. Additionally, I touched briefly on what we might call the social service activities of veterans programs. I would like to see more done, particularly at regional and local levels. The exhibit Wartime Housing traveled, but it traveled as flat panels. And in my mind, I have a digital project that tracks how each site that it went to altered it to fit local realities and shifted it to embrace conditions on the ground. And I would love to learn more about its local incarnations, which were less elaborate than the installation at MoMA. I also, in my spare time, would be working on a history of the International Council of Museums and the role of those involved in U.S. hemispheric unity and in U.S. museum craft in that body. We have an institutional history. I'm not sure about foreign language histories, but I would love to see the rest of the story that I touch on at the end of the book. So those are some initial things that come to mind. And the Tantaquidgeon Museum, we do, as I mentioned at the end of the book, uh, Indigenous founded and operated, Black founded and operated museums are coming into place during this time, and their contributions in their nascent stage would be very useful to understand during this period.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Jason Okrasa, who is a Park Service colleague based in Pearl Harbor, writes, I find it interesting that 9/11 pushed you into this interest. I was in high school during 9/11, and it pushed me to the study of 1941 and the events here in Oahu on the 7th of December, 1941. I didn't know if you wanted to elaborate on that sort of piece of your inspiration.
Yeah, I had actually started this project before 9/11, but that really galvanized my interest in understanding how this exhibitionary network, which exists in different ways in our own time, shaped what museums did and where museums worked with it, pushed against it. I can certainly say that in terms of the bombing of Pearl Harbor, that the Honolulu Academy of Arts opened its doors just 2 days after the bombing, and staff there and at the Bernice Bishop Museum had moved swiftly in the hours after the attack and during their normal Monday closure, I might add, to put emergency plans into play, from removing selected collections material to safer locations and rearranging the galleries so that they could be a haven in this important moment of upheaval. I would love, and I know there's been some written about the local museum's responses during that time, but I think more could be done with that.
Absolutely. And Jason just added, likewise, 9/11 galvanized me and pushed my focus here versus other areas I was looking at, like the American Civil War, the Texas War of Independence.
Yeah.
Our next
And more needs to be done on museums in World War I in the US. I found a little as I was going through, and I think in part the American Association of Museums, as it was called at the time, was newer, published its proceedings less frequently, and US involvement was later and shorter. But that's another, if I can't do it, I hope somebody else does it, area to move beyond journal articles. Yeah.
Yeah, wonderful. Speaking of future work, the next question I'll pass along to Emily, actually, which is Emily put an answer in the chat, but I didn't know if you wanted to sort of share for other folks too, Emily. Michael Binder wants to know, when will the NPS and NCPH extend this program to the Cold War home front?
Sure, good question. The American World War II Heritage City Program was established by Congress and has authorizing legislation that focuses on the years 1941 to 1945. So for the program itself to expand, that would require, change or expansion of the legislation. However, many of the heritage cities that are designated under this program do have continuing Cold War histories, with lots of local museums or publications where you can learn about that. Saw someone here from Dayton, Ohio. I know that that city is one of them. And then also there's some National Park Service resources out there already related to the Cold War. There's a subject site, and I put the links in the Q&A where you can find some articles and parks that are related to Cold War historic sites, as well as a National Historic Landmark theme study.
Thank you so much. Our next question comes from E.M. Loomer. What advice would you have for a public historian that is working for a military museum who has to balance museum training and military doctrine?
Not having had a military background myself, I ex if do you mean, I wonder if our speaker means thinking about examining the work that military museums did during World War II, and certainly civilian museums cooperated with the military, took on exhibits developed by the military during World War II. So there, I would perhaps look at the interplay between uh, military organizations at local fort levels, where museums were preparing exhibition for those in training to spend leisure time with on base. So that would be an area where thinking about the synergies between military organizations at different levels and museums at different levels and how they tried to work together to educate each other, educating civilians about military operations and bringing peacetime or non-war related materials into the military environment. That would be an area where just have to be a good historian and see what the facts reveal about the synergies, the tensions in any of these exhibits. And as we know ourselves, not everybody gets what they want. And the final product as, resembles, in some ways, a divergence from some of the early ambitions and ideas, and to be attentive to those.
Thank you so much. We have time for a couple more questions if folks want to add those into either the chat or the Q&A window on your Zoom. And while we're waiting for more questions to come in, I'll just take this opportunity to say that I hope folks will join us next week for the 2 remaining presentations in this series. Next week, we will be meeting on Wednesday and Friday, and on Wednesday, we'll be joined by Cassie Tanks to explore fences of war, spatial boundaries, and microhistories of World War II. And I'll remind everyone that we are gathering all the links that have been shared in the chat, and we are recording all these presentations. And so at the conclusion of this series, we will put all of that together and send it to you. I know I'm interested in reading more of the work that we've heard about, even just already in this series. Is there
Might
any?
also say,
Yeah.
oh, go ahead. I was going to pick up on the interest in Cold War history, that in the chapter addressing gateways to global citizenship and how museums are anticipating the peace to come, and how, as we move from 45 into the later years, the Cold War political complications, particularly with regard to relationships with the Soviet Union, catch some museums flat-footed in terms of, we had been promoting Russian-American Allied cooperation and particular exhibit at the New York Museum of Science and Industry that didn't get the memo early enough that, oh, no, we are not continuing to do this relationship building work, and which was picketed by members of Baltic nations seeking to call attention to the oppression of their national identities. So that would be a chapter for those who want to look deeper into museum Cold War history to start with. The older histories, meaning written before I did this work, focus on CIA and exhibition abroad museum work. And so the entanglement there of Cold War interests, government, museum interplay. And that's certainly part of the story, but I think there's much more to tell.
Thank
Do we
you.
ever think there's not much more to tell? I don't know.
Oh, I think we'd all be out of work if that were the case. I wanted to share some nice comments that have gone in the Q&A, just saying thank you for this wonderful presentation. And now we have Emily in the chat has said, you noted that the emphasis on social instrumentality waned in museums after the war, if I understood correctly. Was that a direct reaction to the end of the war, complication of the Cold War, or other factors? Was there another shift in the museum world at that time?
It is several factors. The politics do become more complicated, and there's lower tolerance for being on the wrong side as a few false steps are taken. Also, the temporary exhibits that flourished during the war years were abundant. The museum itself didn't need to make all of the temporary exhibits because of this exhibitionary network. And while that continued to some degree, the time, the expense, there was waning willpower to continue that pace, and collections were coming back into the galleries. And so there was a refocus on permanent collections, which lent themselves in many cases less readily at that time and way of thinking to contemporary civic topics. So it's not that it didn't happen. Also, the one world universalist conception of human sameness put a great emphasis on art as a lingua franca, that we don't need words, we can understand intuitively. And so there was a resurgence in art exhibits that utilized art, clothing, other handcraft as a way to communicate unity more with beauty and less with words. And at this time, other than small historical society museums, art museums were the predominant disciplinary type. And we also see the return of men from war, the exiting of women from the field. So there's a reshuffling too of who's doing the work. So there are multiple factors, and I think I summarize what some of the forces are, but I hope someone gives more attention and picks that apart and goes into greater detail.
Thank you so much. Any closing thoughts that you would like to share, or Emily, that you would like to share as we hit the top of the hour here? All right. Well, I want to thank you all once again for taking time out of your Friday to join us. Clarissa, thank you so much for sharing your work with us. I know as someone who gets to work with you on organizational matters, it's such a joy to learn more about the things that actually make you passionate about history. So thank you for sharing with us. Um, uh,
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to again thank everyone. Uh, I'm happy to share information, talk to classes. Please don't hesitate to contact me if you'd like to continue conversation or tell me about what you're working on, and perhaps I have context that could assist your work, or maybe things that I copied that aren't digitized that could help you out.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much for that offer. I also want to thank Emily Cambick, Jason O'Crossa, and Terkaya Lowe for trusting NCPH to partner with them on so many wonderful projects over the last number of years related to the World War II home front. Again, we'll share out the links and the recording. I hope that you'll join us for the rest of the series, and I hope that you all stay safe and warm this weekend. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you so much.